Thank you for having me. Today, I'll be presenting our work on cash use and financial literacy, insights from combining payment surveys with big data. Before we start, I would ask that you please do not cite or circulate without prior permission. And I would mention that the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada, as the sole issuer of banknotes in Canada, monitors the adoption and use of cash and other methods of payment. Though use of cash at the point of sale has decreased over time, many still hold and use cash, and the amount of cash in circulation has been stable or increasing as a share of GDP. Financial literacy, defined as the ability to understand and use financial concepts, may play a role in the demand and use of cash in several ways. As we will see, those with low financial literacy tend to use more cash and fewer credit cards. The relationship between credit card ownership and cash use is confounded. In particular, there's a distinction between those who choose not to adopt credit cards because they prefer cash, and those who can't adopt credit cards because they have difficulty being approved for one. It is in this context that we study the role of financial literacy. In this presentation, we will develop a model of credit card ownership and cash holdings, using survey data and administrative data to come up with an identification strategy. We measure financial literacy using the Big 3 skill testing questions developed by Nicholls and Mitchell 2011. These 3 questions test the concepts of interest rates, inflation, and risk diversification, respectively. We classify respondents into low, medium, and high categories based on the number of correct, incorrect, and don't know answers to these questions. In particular, we find that 42% have high financial literacy, meaning they answered all 3 questions correctly. Here we summarize some of the descriptive findings from the paper. We find that compared with high literacy respondents, low literacy respondents are less likely to own a credit card and less likely to use credit cards at the point of sale even if they own one, are more credit constrained, that is, they have lower credit scores and lower credit limits. In terms of cash use, they are more likely to hold large denomination notes, are more likely to use cash for budgetary or savings purposes, and are less likely to hold cash for emergency preparedness purposes. From regression analysis, we find that credit card ownership is correlated with cash holdings, and that financial literacy is correlated with credit card ownership. As discussed, credit card ownership may be endogenous. Some may choose not to adopt credit cards because they prefer cash, and some may not be able to adopt credit cards due to supply-side constraints. We therefore look to supply-side sources of information as we develop our identification strategy. We model cash and credit use in 2 stages. In the first stage, we model the probability of owning a credit card. In the second stage, we model log of cash holdings. There are 2 cash holdings equations, one for credit card owners and one for non-owners. Xi represent weekly exogenous variables, including demographics and financial literacy. Zi represent exclusion restrictions. To be valid, Zi must include variables that impact credit card ownership directly, but only impact cash holdings indirectly through credit card ownership. In the next slide, we will use administrative data to construct such variables. We use data from 2 sources. One is the 2017 Methods of Payment Survey, or MOP, which is a consumer survey on cash and payment use, and has a sample size of about 3,000. The second data source is a credit registry, which contains many millions of records and has details on individuals' credit cards and credit scores. To match the MOP with credit scores from the registry, we use information on FSA, age group, and many credit card characteristics. As an example, consider survey participant A on the left. Using the credit registry, we find 2 entries, B and C, that match exactly. In this case, the participant would be assigned the average of these 2 credit scores. If no exact matches exist, we use fuzzy matching with a smaller set of variables. For example, participant D differs only by FSA. 88% of the sample is matched either exactly or through fuzzy matching. Remaining observations are imputed using a k-nearest neighbors method. We also match with data on paper and email credit card advertising. We refer you to the paper for more details. We now compare counterfactual results from 2 models. In both models, we consider the effects on cash holdings if we were to educate respondents such that everyone had high financial literacy. In a linear regression context, we capture only the marginal effect of literacy on cash holdings and find that cash holdings increase by about 0.4%. In the switching regression context, we capture the extensive margin, where credit card ownership is allowed to change, and the intensive margin, where credit card ownership is fixed. On the extensive margin, cash holdings rise by 5%. In other words, an increase in literacy is associated with an increase in the number of credit card adopters who tend to have higher incomes and hold more cash. On the intensive margin, cash holdings fall by 6%, dominating the extensive margin effect. In other words, conditional on credit card ownership, those with higher literacy tend to hold less cash. The overall net effect of an increase in financial literacy is therefore 1%. Thanks very much. I'm now available to answer any questions.